folks. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Friday morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Robinovitch. Now, Steve, some of you might know, used to be president of the Canadian Society for Biomechanics. Because he's a company guy, we're going to make a quick plug for CSB this morning. There we go. And so I'd invite you all to the CSB Symposium between 3 and 4 o'clock. It's a summary of career awardees, and the presenters will include Jack Callahan, Walter Herzog, Ron Zernicke, and Cheryl Hubley-Cozy. The challenge I gave them was to talk about their research program and the future, and I gave them 10 minutes to do it each. So we welcome and look forward to seeing as many people there as possible. But back to the task at hand now. Steve Robinovitch is a professor in the Department of Biomedical Physiology and Kinesiology at Simon Fraser University, as well as jointly appointed with the engineering science there. He's been there for almost 20 years now and has a wealth of knowledge related to falls, fall prevention, and injury prevention in the event of falls. I will leave it at that because he's tight on time already. So let's welcome Steve.
Thank you, Andrew, and it really is a delight to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you about some of the work we're doing in this area. I'm going to start by some kind of thought experiments and ask you to think about, first of all, well, think about the last time you fell. And first of all, okay, well, let's remember that falling is an unintentional descent to a lower level. So we're not talking about jumping off something intentionally. But, so think about what were you doing at the time of the fall, and what caused you to lose your balance. So as you ponder that, I want you to think a little bit more about that fall. And these questions, did you get injured when you fell? And if you didn't get injured, what did you do to prevent injury? So, I don't know if we'll have time at the end of the talk, but if some brave souls want to share their experiences, we can relate those personal experiences to some of the things we're going to talk about. So, falls are complex. Preventing falls in older adults is a very challenging problem. And one of the reasons is because of this interaction between physiological, behavioral, and environmental risk factors. So we may be able to identify and target physiological factors, but that might not be everything. Same thing with environmental factors. We are especially interested in my research group in injuries related to falls, and here we see some of the big ones. Hip fracture, probably the most significant injury related to falls. 90% of hip fractures are caused by falls, 25% of people will die within 1 year, 50% will lose independence. The other big injury, the one that's actually growing in terms of incidence, is traumatic brain injuries. About 80% of TBIs in older adults are caused by falls. Over 40% of fall-related deaths are due to brain injury. And we're seeing this increase of 2- to 3-fold in the last decade in the age-adjusted incidence of fall-related TBI in older adults. So I'm going to show you lots of videos during this presentation, and this is really the most fun video. I spent some time working with Karen Adolph at NYU, and she studies infant motor development. And we see these children fall literally dozens of times per hour during play with very little harm, no ill effects, really. This was one of the very few videos that I looked at with Karen where the baby impacted her head. But when you think about like how, those questions I posed to you earlier, like what were the babies doing? How did they lose their balance? It's not slips or trips. It's related to develop the acquisition of balance and coordination to walk and explore, and there are things like incorrect weight shifting and loss of support, things that we're going to see actually are very common as a cause of falls in older adults. Over the years, we've done experiments in my lab looking at how young, healthy people fall. And this was an experiment where we had 44 people come in one afternoon. It was just a single perturbation. They had really no idea what was going to happen or the stiffness of the surface. And we induced sideways falls, and we saw quite repeatable protective responses. The falls weren't just sort of random and unpredictable, that there was this coordinated and common series of protective responses. You see that there's about 700 milliseconds in a fall, and there's this really tight coordination between the timing of impact to multiple body parts, like the wrist and the pelvis, suggesting a sharing of impact energy. The other thing that we saw in all of these falls with younger adults in the lab, no head impact. So there seems to be a prioritization in protective responses to avoidance of head impact. Makes sense. So over the years, we've developed partnerships that have allowed us to study falls in older adults in 2 partnering long-term care facilities in the Vancouver area. And I'm going to touch on many of the aspects of the research, mostly on video. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about wearable sensors, and we'll talk about hip protectors as well. So what are we doing in these homes? We have video cameras set up in common areas, hallways, dining rooms, lounges, and this allows us to collect video footage of falls. Over now a 12-year period, we have collected over 2,500 falls in over 700 residents. For many individuals, we have consent to access their medical records, and for many of them, consent for sharing of video for research and education. So all the images and video that I'm showing of older adults in this talk, that is that group that we have consent to show those videos. I'll mention, if you're going to take a photo or whatever, that's okay. There are a few slides that I've marked in the lower right corner that I'm going to present some new research that I don't want you to photograph. Now, you can access, as researchers, you can access a portion of these videos. We have posted to a site called, a network called Databrary, which Karen Adolph at NYU manages. Posted 105 falls, along with clinical status of the individuals. So if you're interested in accessing this, please send me an email and I'll help to set you up with the people at Databrary. So, again, I asked you to think about what were you doing last time you fell? How did you lose your balance? When we look at falls in older adults, sometimes we can identify a single primary cause that is preventable. In this case, this woman seems to observe and try to walk around, but she trips on that lift device. That really shouldn't be ideally in that forward. Here's another fall where this gentleman is sitting down on a wheelchair that moves away. There should be self-locking brakes that don't, prevent that wheelchair from moving until the individual is fully seated. So you might say, oh, well, I can prevent these falls. I just, environmental design, product design. Well, let's look at a fall like this, which really is more typical. This woman's exhibiting excessive sway. And you might notice that fall seems quite severe. And the severity really has to do, if we look at it again, with the landing and her head. Doesn't impact the ground, but the lack of control of the head is something that's really striking. Hard to prevent that fall. How about this fall? Again, quite typical, where this woman is attempting to transfer. Even though she has only mild dementia, she's probably, in a way, affected in terms of risk-taking and judgment. She's not close enough. She grabs onto a chair that moves, that doesn't provide a steady support, and she falls. So transfers are definitely a danger time for older adults and falls. So we've got the video evidence. How do we analyze it? Well, we have worked to develop a structured questionnaire. We have validated the questionnaire in terms of interrelated reliability, and it breaks down the fall with specific questions and a set number of responses for issues related to fall initiation, descent, and impact. And here you see the list of parameters that we examine through the questionnaire. You can download this questionnaire through the BMC article, and I'll talk about some of the things that we're finding. So, first, let's talk about the answer to that question I posed to you earlier in terms of what we see on the videos of falls in older adults. 14% of falls are due to trips. This is in long-term care, like 1% are due to slips. So, slipping hazards are very quickly mopped up. The largest category is incorrect weight shifting. So what do we mean by that? Well, we might mean like excessive sway, like we saw in that woman. We might mean a misstep during walking. That might look like a trip, but if you look closer, it's really not a trip. We might talk about things like rising from a chair and not establishing balanced state during rising. So that's the biomechanical manner or causes of imbalance. What about what people are doing? Well, falls are really equally common in this population during transferring as during walking. Even common, 24% of falls occur during standing. So it's not only walking. And so these kind of results help guide assessment, screening, interventions for exercise. What about individual fallers? And here you see a group of frequent fallers who experienced between 9 and 44 falls that we had captured on video. You might think like, well, Mrs. Smith, she's got a set of physiological risk factors for falls. Her falls are probably consistent. No. For the most part, the variability in things like the activity, the time of the fall, the cause of the fall, is just as great within the individual who is falling repeatedly as it is across the population that we're studying. So again, it makes it challenging to sort of, identify and, specific cause and target that. We need more universal sort of precautions and approaches to assessment and prevention. Now, as I mentioned, we're really interested in injuries. So let's talk about head impact. It occurs in this population in 1/3 of falls. And if we look at the injuries that are noted on incident report, 35% of those injuries are to the head. So #1 site for injury. Now, I should have warned you before, but I'll warn you now that some of the videos that we're going to watch related to head impact especially are really hard, difficult to watch. But that's why I say, that's why we're studying this. That's why it's important. But let's first look and see, okay, what about the direction of the fall? How did that associate with the risk for head injury? What we see is that falls that involve a forward landing configuration, and we think about fall direction, and this is kind of important. We think about fall direction, it's not a single direction. It's not like someone always starts falling sideways and lands sideways. You will see in the next slide, like, rotation is really common. So here we're talking about landing. Forward landings involve the highest risk for head impact. You can see that 50% of them result in head impact, but only 11% of falls involve forward landing. So the much larger category of head impact is the back of the head. It was the most common site for head impact, and even sideways was more common than forward. Now, how come only 11% of falls are forward landings? Well, part of the story there is that people are rotating during descent. And these older adults in long-term care, there is a clear preference for rotation away from forward, like towards sideways, from even sideways to backward. You can see a large portion of the 19% of falls that started within a forward initial fall direction, a lot of them ended up sideways. Same thing with sideways ending up backward. And we'll come back to think about, like, okay, why is that? I've already given you a hint showing like 50% of forward landings involve head impact. But first, let's look at success stories. It's not a success, of course, because it was involved, but you look at these sort of falls, and there is no head impact, and you can think about what are people doing, what are the strategies they are using to avoid head impact. Upper limb fall arrest in a forward fall. This was a fall from lower than standing height. Here's rotation, where she starts falling sideways, she rotates to land backwards, she has proper neck and trunk control to maintain the head off the ground. Now let's look at some of these ones that are involving head impact. There's a forward fall. She attempts to get her hand out, but either placement or collapse, backward fall, first the pelvis, then the head. Forward fall, gets the hands out, but minimal hand contact force and ability to arrest. Looking at risk factors, we see that rotation away from forward is protective. As we talked about, landing forward increases risk. And look, hand impact had no effect. And you think like, if I'm going to avoid hand impact in a fall, I'm going to use my hands. And yes, people, as we saw, are using their hands, but overall, there is no association. It's just as often the hands collapse or ineffective. If we look at physiologic risk factors, poor vision, women are more likely to impact their head than men, maybe related to strength. So what can we do about it? Well, one of the things that we are working on is exercise. I'm not going to talk about that, but you can imagine, integrating exercise into fall management or exercise programs for fall prevention that target safe landing. What I will talk about is some of the work that we're doing to not only just like classify the falls based on this questionnaire, but now analyze the falls kinematically, and then to use that information to drive the design of improved setups for assessing head trauma and the effective interventions like compliant flooring or protective headgear. We're working with colleagues to combine that with finite element analysis, and this is really a direction that we're pushing right now. So, how well can we analyze the kinematics of falls with just planar video? Well, we're using a program called Kinematics. It's open source software that some of you may be familiar with. And here's a fall in the lab where we're capturing the fall with a camera that's pretty much the same as a video camera in long-term care. And Kinematics is being used to analyze the trajectories. And then what I'm showing here are resultant velocities. This is the work of Natalie Shishov and Karim Elab in my lab. And when we look at comparison between the maximum values or impact values for velocity to the pelvis, to the hand, to the head, comparing mocap to Kinematic, we get very good agreement. Now we select falls that have good planar views, and again, this is some of the work that Karim's done. So here's an example of a real-life fall where you see the calibration board and the use of Kinematic to analyze the trajectories. And it's interesting that you see in this fall, similar to the fall I showed before, this backward fall, where first there's pelvis impact, then there's rapid downward movement. It's kind of like a whip-like motion, but you can think about first initial descent stage followed by pelvis impact, then a second descent stage of the torso and the head impact. And here you see those velocities associated with those two different stages. Here's another case where we've used Kinematic to analyze the kinematics of a fall that did not involve head impact. And we can think about, okay, what's going on here? It seems like improved neck and trunk control, but what else do you see here? The legs raise way up. And this is something that we've become fascinated with. Like, it's a recent observation that we've had, like, wow, it seems like a lot of falls that don't involve head impact involve this kind of leg raise. And is it passive? Is it active? Is it related to, you know, joint torques that are acting to keep the torso up as well as rotate the legs up? Is it angular momentum, where the body is basically pivoting about its center of mass, which is close to the pelvis, and this rapid upward movement of the legs slows down the descent of the torso? A lot of sort of interesting biomechanics there that we're starting to explore. Now, this is Karen's work where he's using those kinematics to drive the design of a falling dummy. And we're starting pretty simple with backward falls and like a 3-degree of freedom system. And here you'll see some of the different configurations of the dummy that he's examining. So a curved torso, a flat torso, legs that are either rigidly fixed or freely rotating. We're looking at different, you know, neck stiffnesses, but here we're just looking at the effect of the torso shape and the legs. We're seeing with this dummy a really big difference in not only impact velocity, but even more striking differences where if the legs are freely rotating, the impact severity of the head is much higher. So again, it's kind of relating to what we were seeing in those videos with older adults. But the dummy gives us a nice way to sort of partition and, you know, examine separately how does a specific dynamic parameter associate with impact severity. It also, of course, allows us to examine the effect of floors, compliant floors, and protective headgear. Now, so this is all very new. We're seeing, you know, that the flooring provides substantial reduction in head impact severity, different types of headgear providing reduction. Another part of the research here is, of course, what will older adults be willing to wear? So we're working with older adults and care providers to try and address that question and sort of iteratively identify something that works biomechanically, is as good as a helmet, but also is something that older adults are willing to wear. Maybe we can change the culture in long-term care or acute care towards, you know, acceptance of this kind of thing for those high-risk older adults who might hit their head in a hole. Now let's talk briefly about hip fracture. So only 1.5% of falls cause hip fracture. And so we've collected, you know, 2,500 falls. We have about 30 hip fractures. And we're just doing some analysis of these falls that resulted in hip fracture. And I think one of the most surprising things is fall direction. We always think of hip fracture as being caused by sideways falls, but I explained to you that initial fall direction and landing configuration are different. I explained that there's this tendency for rotation. So that's one of the things that we found about hip fractures. And here's a typical case, that risk for hip fracture during a fall is higher in falls that are initially forward with sideways landings, like this case, or falls that are initially sideways. It's the backward falls that involve less risk. Let's look at another case here, where this fall might not look so unusual, but if you slow it down and you look and see, the vast majority of the impact energy of that fall was absorbed by the pelvis. There's posterolateral impact, and that's what we find is actually really common. Impact the posterolateral aspect of the hip causing fracture. Now, hip protectors, do they work? Will people wear them? That's the big question. There's previous evidence that certain types of hip protectors work, and also evidence that people are reluctant to wear them. But I talked about like wanting to create a culture shift towards headgear. We've already made some substantial progress in that area with regard to hip protectors. In British Columbia, we studied 14 different long-term care facilities in the Fraser Health region. We found that 60% of falls, out of 3,500 falls over 1 year in these 14 long-term care facilities, 60% of falls, people were wearing hip protectors. So that's like a major success story that we're getting staff committed, we're getting people wearing hip protectors. Did they work? Yes, they caused a threefold reduction in the risk for hip fracture without increasing the risk for pelvis fracture. There's a higher number of pelvic fractures, but that has to do with the portion of falls, the higher portion of falls that were padded. So yeah, hip fractures are being reduced and people are wearing hip protectors. So we're now working with colleagues to try and translate that success in British Columbia to Ontario, where use of hip protectors in long-term care is not nearly as high. We're also developing CSA standards for testing of hip protectors so that we make sure that there are correct devices out there on the market. And we now have converted this express document to a standard that is now in the public review stage. If you have interest in looking at that standard and reviewing the document, send me an email. Now yesterday, Dr. Valerie presented a slide showing an inflatable hip protector. We also are working with colleagues on inflatable hip protectors. So I kind of regard this as like the Rolls-Royce of hip protectors. It's probably going to provide way more protection than just a normal passive foam pad, but the cost will likely be prohibitive for most. So we're working on the other end of the spectrum as well, where we have stick-on hip protectors for acute care that adhere to the skin like a bandage and protect or reduce the risk for hip fracture while that patient is in the hospital. Okay, I have, there's some new work that I want to present to you, which is the research of a PhD student, Natalie Shishop, in my lab. She's interested in the role of vision in falls. And we started thinking of this when we observed some of the videos, and you could kind of relate it to, like, you know, your own experiences. Like, think about where you would rather fall if you were to experience a fall, on this sandy beach or on this, like, you know, riverbed. The answer, of course, is pretty obvious. And then we think about falls like this in long-term care. And long-term care, like, I'm driven crazy by the sharp corners and edges and hard surfaces, and you look at this fall, and clearly there was an awareness by the individual of that hazard. I mean, he's heading right towards the table. He's either going to spear his chest or his head on the table, but he's able to coordinate in some way his stepping responses where he's trying to recover balance and duck and miss that table, if we look at it one more time. How did he know that that table was there? So, obviously, vision and visual mapping and internal models related to that seem to have an important role. We have setups in the lab. This is another fun video, a younger person falling, just showing the kind of falls that we can induce with our platform in the lab. Here's Karam. He asked me to please play this video. We get these circular perturbations. And so Natalie's using this setup with eye tracking, to examine the role of vision in falls. Like, what are people doing? Where are people looking? So it's a lot of work. She's done a lot of work to integrate the eye tracker with our mocap. And you think, like, this is a simple environment here. So what's happening with vision? Well, it seems that the faller is using vision to map the environment and hazards related to, here she's looking, how close is the edge of the platform to where I am? We can also create a more complex environment. So these chairs look kind of scary. They're actually foam chairs. We don't tell the individual that on the first perturbation. And let's look at what happens with vision here. What we see, that's in real time, but if we slow it down, is we see an initial eye movement or saccade, then followed by a second really rapid movement, directed right toward where the individual is landing. And if we look at the eye angular velocities and look at the saccades, this is what we see. It's like an initial really fast saccade, then a second saccade that is toward the chair, then fixation on the edge of the chair, which is probably like a danger zone or where they want to coordinate their landing. And then finally, a third saccade that moves the eyes closer to the impact site for the hands. So, 1 minute, I'm going to talk about wearable sensors and fall detection of wearable sensors. We've had people wearing wearable sensors along with, in long-term care where we're capturing video footage of falls, but it's a very tough business to get falls, to capture both video and get falls with wearable sensors. In fact, this was the work of Omar Aziz, who's now working at Apple on fall detection with the Apple Watch. This was the only fall he was able to capture wearable sensor data. But he did a lot of other things related to the development and design of fall monitoring tools with wearable sensors. He used the video evidence that I've been showing you to design paradigms where young people in the lab would basically mimic, act out the falling scenarios that we see are common in older adults. We also did near falls, we did activities of daily living, and if you were interested, we have like an extensive data set that you could freely download of sensor data from ankle, waist, torso, wrist. And what Omar did is he compared threshold-based techniques with machine learning to see, can we improve the accuracy, reduce false positives, and increase sensitivity and specificity. And he found that indeed machine learning does a little bit better than threshold-based techniques. And of course it depends on the number and location of sensors and everything like that. But here's the problem, is that you're trying to get this dichotomous outcome every 5 seconds from the sensor system. Did a fall occur, yes or no? There are 17,000 5-second periods in a day. So you need 99.994% specificity. That translates to 1 false positive a day. You need so close to 100% specificity to not have false positives. Now, you might think, well, I want to capture, I want to, sound the alarm when a fall occurs. So doing both, you just can't do it. Either you go towards a system, you design it so that it's going to tell you every time a person falls that it's going to sound the alarm, but then you're going to get a lot of false positives. You're sitting at 96 specificity. Or you go to a system that has no false positives, but it's going to miss 2 out of 10 falls. That's 80% sensitivity. So it's not an easy thing. This is, with our current technology, I'm sure that there's so many great talented people working on this problem that we'll continue to see progress, but that's the nature of the problem. It's a lot more difficult than just activity detection, where being wrong for 1 frame of the movement has no consequences. Here, it's a false alarm that can cause a lot of problems. So with that, I will thank you very much for your time, and it's great to have some questions.
About 10 minutes left. I would request that folks move up to the microphones, just to make sure that everyone in the audience can hear.
Hi, Steve. How are you? Cecile Smith from Sherbrooke University. I'm actually curious about your last slide there about the 99% specificity of your fall detection device. Can you comment a bit about, okay, so we're getting false positive, but in certain cases, is that a bad thing? For example, if you're bidding a harness system and you want to make sure that it catches people before they fall, getting a few false positives isn't that bad of a thing. You'd rather catch them than have them go to the ground. You don't want any false negatives. That makes sense. So can you comment a bit about the fact that I agree that the alarm's going to be triggered and you're going to send 911 and everything. Okay, that seems to be a good thing. But in certain cases, it might be okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so that's a kind of application. Like I'm thinking specifically about the role of wearable sensors for the older adult who's living alone, and a call is made to deliver care,
Yeah.
or a call is made to the son or daughter. and eventually you're going to have a problem with the fried wolf sort of, thing. I mean, companies, are trying to deal with this, but you're talking about a different scenario where I agree, like in some of those sort of things where, you might want to use a harness when you detect a fall with a sensor, that could be different. So yeah, that's a more specific application.
Hi, over here on this side. I'm Antonia Zafariou from Stevens Institute of Technology. Thank you very much for this talk. I'm wondering, of the turns you classified as weight shifts, how many of those had to do with either planning a turn or being in a context like the end of the hall where you might need to turn but they weren't turning yet? And a second question is, which interventions for balance training excite you most, given what you've seen?
Well, I'm trying to remember the exact portion of falls that occurred during turning. It's relatively high, but it's not as high as we might think. Like, I like to, use the analogy that, individuals that we are studying are often at risk for falls during, all sorts of activities. So, we've looked like, is it during the initiation of gait or termination of gait? Is it during turning? And, some of the previous publications have sort of implicated turning as, a cause of falls in community-dwelling older adults. I don't think we're seeing that. We're not seeing like that is like way more prevalent than just steady forward walking. But again, it's this population. Yeah, sorry, remind me your second question. Oh, exercise.
Oh, and can I follow up? Then is the portion of the really dangerous falls during turns?
Yeah.
Because I know that some of the examples really were during.
Yeah, there was that one hip fracture video that I showed that if you back it up, you can see that she's turning. But if we look at activity, I don't think, we only have 30 hip fractures. I don't think we have enough to really say that, turning was more common. But it is a good question. Now, with regard to exercise, my push is like, let's think of it as a continuum. Like, I think it's fantastic that we are now paying more attention, as we've been calling for years, to perturbation training, like balance recovery, like exposing people to perturbations, where I like to think they kind of reawaken motor programs that might be dormant because, they're not very active and so on. But the thing that I like to push is let's think of these responses on a continuum. That I lose my balance, and first I might try like feet in place, then I can do, stepping or grasping, and then there's this transition, this recognition at some point, well, I'm falling, I better do something to avoid injury. But, so can we somehow integrate that into perturbation training safely? I think we need to start with older adults when they're 65, or even younger, just to like maintain these abilities. But you might think, can I take a fall? Like, it's not just risk for falls, it's the ability to take a fall without injury.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie, from TU Delft. Very exciting work you're presenting. I was intrigued by your observation that the one person who was falling and basically throwing the legs up in the air basically protected himself from the injury. And this looks similar to what people get instructed to do in Judo. So I was wondering whether you have compared it to this type of intentional trained falls and whether you potentially even see a potential for structurally teaching elderly adults Judo following up on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're coming from a place that, Vivian Liederstein, who I worked with, really sort of pioneered that program that got attention in the New York Times and so on. And initially I'd argue with Vivian, like, I don't think it's right what you're doing because, and I still believe that the idea of training a completely foreign falling response and expecting that that will be elicited in an unexpected fall scenario is, I think, very questionable. We've had black belts in Judo come into the lab and we've done perturbation, I showed in the third slide, and they don't fall any differently than age-matched controls. When we ask them, now fall with the Judo technique, then they can do it. But my opinion, so I'd argue with Vivian, like, I don't think you should try and train. Instead, you should look at what people are doing naturally and then see if you can enhance those responses. And I think that's still the way to go. But I think there's a convergence here of the way in which older adults are falling in long-term care with the rotation and the raising of the legs. It's like, I can't deny there's elements of that that are the same as the Judo falls. So now I'm a big supporter of the Judo fall, because I think it's compatible with the fact that this is the way. And I think these older adults have over time developed techniques that they're falling differently. Like the rotation, like would we see that as often in young? I don't know, we haven't studied that. Like people haven't studied falls in young people, like real life falls. But I like to think of like, imagine like your hands are stuck in your pockets, and that's, you know, in that case you're going to rotate if you fall forward. But that's what we're seeing like with older adults, because they've lost the ability to rest with arms.
Thank you very much.
Peter Scholl from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Thanks for the nice talk. I have a question about wearables. Do you think that you could use wearables to not just prevent falls, but not just assess falls, but prevent them, or mitigate the impact of the fall, such as giving some kind of haptic feedback or audio feedback or something as they're about to fall? Or is it just too fast and it's all completely pre-programmed what they're going to do? What do you think about that?
I think it's a fascinating question, but I don't know. I don't think there's anything we've done, at least with older adults. With young adults, like we've done all sorts of things, like giving them an instruction in the middle of the fall to land a certain way, and we can see that, yeah, they can switch, like they're 700 milliseconds, so it's plenty of time to elicit voluntary responses. Whether in a real-life fall, where we see, in fact, there's even longer, like the descent is 700 milliseconds, but the imbalance, right, it's an imbalance to landing can be 2 seconds. So I think, yeah, the notion of detecting and providing biofeedback or detecting imbalance, like we've done some work with sensors of like just detecting imbalance with the whole idea of what you're saying, like provide some sort of feedback to the individual, but I'm not aware, there may be some research in that area. It's a fascinating question, but whether it's feasible is, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan Gregory from UMass Amherst. Thank you for the great talk. You mentioned in your talk about the apprehension of the older individuals for wearing like the headsets or whatever. I'm curious about if you have any information on apprehension about the older individuals, especially in community care, for actually partaking in exercise interventions. And I'm also curious if you know how much potential there actually is for these older individuals that do partake in preventative exercise to actually improve or reduce their risk of falling.
Yeah, I mean, great questions, and I'm probably not the best in terms of being able to answer the question about like what portion of older adults in different settings can you convince to pursue exercise. You know, we always hear about this, you know, the adherence once someone is accepted, but I haven't read that much. I'm sure there are people maybe in the audience who know more about initially about like what portion might agree. Yeah, remind me the second part of your question about exercise.
The second part of the question was about the capacity to improve. So,
yes.
So once they start
intervention,
yes. How much can they improve?
Okay, so I knew there was something I want to say about that. I think like the vast majority of evidence is that exercise reduces falls. But I think we have traditionally, and with the interest like of the biomechanics community in wearable sensors, I think we should be able to start addressing what I think has been a major limitation of how we interpret the exercise data. And that is like, I think you should look at falls per unit activity. So let's say someone is sedentary, they're just, you know, lounging around, they're really not doing very much, and then they fall once a year. And then you get them into an exercise program, and all of a sudden, they're way more active, they're walking around in the community and so on. They're doing different exercises. Maybe they still have that one fall a year, but if you use like a denominator that's per unit activity, and that's what we want. You know, we want to promote safe mobility, so to get the person moving, and so yeah, I think so we're starting now, I think, to be able to track physical activity with wearable sensors, that will improve. But I mean, there's just no doubt that exercise is beneficial in terms of balance, mobility, falls. Thank you.
I'm Jeremy Kershaw from the University of Delaware. So you have 12 years of data for a pretty heterogeneous group of people. Do you have enough data, or have you looked at how certain neuromuscular impairments, such as maybe chronic stroke, Parkinson's, dementia, diabetes, how that alters the risk for certain fall directions or impact locations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we've done a little bit. I've worked with Andrew. Actually, we published a paper on falls in Parkinson's, comparing some of the characteristics in terms of, attempts to be observed attempts for balance recovery and what are the circumstances and landing configurations. And you're right, we now have the capacity to start doing that for other, more common conditions like stroke and so on. But the problem is just the diversity, even in Parkinson's and certainly in stroke. And we have medical records for about half of the population, but yeah, it's my dilemma of like, when do we stop collecting, right? You think like we have enough, but if we want to just look at like a very specific population or specific scenario, where our sample isn't that large.
Time here and ensuring others can get to the next section. I'm going to end things now, but there are folks have questions. I might talk to Steve afterwards or catch him later at the conference as well. So at this point, let's give another round of applause for Steve.